Okay, fine. Right, I'll press on then. By all means, it's a fairly free and easy evening, so if you do have anything to sort of chip in as you go along, as long as you don't heckle too much, I'm quite happy with that. But it's the longest session. So, Aldbourne's old entertainments. But first of all, a bit of an advisory. We do have some bloodthirsty violence, a bit of alcohol abuse, and definitely health and safety violations, and even a bit of animal abuse. And a bit of non-PC. This is because we're stretching back over a few years and things were different in those days. But you'll be pleased to know there are no flashing images. So we're going to try and keep it quite simple. Right, we start back a long time ago. In fact, when Wellington was just about to meet Napoleon at Waterloo. When was that? Any offers from the audience? Yeah, fair enough. Well, I've bent the rules a bit here since 1814, but I thought you'd probably remember Waterloo rather than the eruption of a big volcanic eruption that took place in 1814. Not many people remember that. But what was happening in Aldbourne about that time? Well, it was about the time charity schools were becoming popular. And so Aldbourne, as usual, up with the things, wanted to have a bit of a fundraising concert. And so in October 1814, well, I suppose it was published in the Salisbury and Winchester Journal that there'd been a concert held in late September in Aldbourne. And it was for the benefit of the charity schools there, so more than one. And 2 sermons were preached on the occasion. And through the earnestness of the preacher and the liberality of the neighbourhood, £67 was collected at the church door. Now, £67 in those days, buying power now is about £3,500. So quite a respectable amount of money. And obviously there was some music, principally gratuitous. I assume that the musicians gave their services for free. And it gave a most crowded congregation the highest satisfaction, nearly 1,500 people. Now, we're now talking about certainly in St. Michael's. So it must have been pretty crowded. So if there are 2 sermons preached, even if you 50-50, that's 750 people. That's pretty tight. At that time, the population of the village, about 1,300. So either they went twice, which is quite possible, or very enthusiastic. Sorry, it's possible. Presumably not. I don't know. Once a preacher starts preaching, I don't know if you're allowed to walk out, but it does rather sound as if they had a good captive audience. Anyway, pretty successful one way or another. I don't know, but they might have still had the private pews, which actually take up more space. Anyway, so, no, not used to this keyboard. A week or so later, we had a thank you from the stewards, James Wells, Robert Church, for the money and excellent and the professional services rendered. And the following January, there was a thank you from Miss Brown. Now, obviously, she was one of those who ran one of the charity schools, and that she's had plenty of support from the opening of her school, and it was going to start again on the 23rd of January. And there's the terms by letter to Aldbourne. So there was at least one school going, and by implication, that first report, there were several schools on the go. But we had to pay to go, so they obviously didn't cover the majority of people. Let's move on to a little bit of sport now. It creeps in from time to time. 1830, Aldbourne had a cricket team. Now, cricket had really kicked off around about the 1750s, 1760s. I'm not well up on my cricket history, but obviously there was enough that there was a lot of local interest, and Aldbourne went over the hill to Lambourne and raised a team, and for a purse of 22 sovereigns, it looks as if they'd all chipped in a sovereign each from the team. I think we can work that one out. That's worth about £1,300 at today's value. So there's all the details of the score. quite interesting that Mr. Coleman's name figures highly, both in the first innings, particularly for Lambourne. He was in the Aldbourne team, I should say. But they didn't do so well because they lost in the end, Aldbourne, which is a bit disappointing. But that was, just as I say, in September 1830. That's the sort of team makeup that there might have been in those days. This is obviously a bit of a fudged photograph. There obviously would be some stalwarts with the bats and some supporters with top hats, so a little bit of class, but a fairly mixed bunch, shall we say. Then there was a return match 10 days later, and Lambourne come over the hills and to play at Aldbourne Down. Never quite sure where Aldbourne Down. This has cropped up before in some of the sporting fixtures. It seems possible that it's perhaps out on West Street Way, somewhere out along there. Manor Farm area, could be, but we're not too sure. Sorry? Cause Gorse, yes, I suppose it could have been up there, anyway. But in the, again, sadly, Aldbourne lost. And Lambourne only losing 1 wicket for their grand total of 166. So not a very successful venture, but at least it was a bit of entertainment. Doesn't mention, you know, spectators, but I'm pretty sure there would have been. But Aldbourne really gets into the swing of things here. 1839, again, a newspaper report, the annual ball at the Crown Inn. I've mentioned this before in one of my earlier talks. When the most of the respectable families, none of your riffraff, most of your respectable families in that part of the country attending. And the dancing kicked off at 8 o'clock in the evening and continued till 1 o'clock. Well, that'd be pushing it these days, I would think. And not only then, that's when they sat down to supper. Mr. Tomlin being the landlord at the time. And then they started dancing again and kept it up with great spirit until an early hour. And too much praise cannot be given to the stewards for their excellent arrangements and polite attention. So that must have been, you know, quite something. And it was an annual ball, so obviously maybe it had been running. And who knows, we could have even been another Bridgerton, couldn't we? Sadly, the authors at that time passed us by. Right, a little while after that, still in 1839, much more down-to-earth event took place, almost literally. A backsword match. Now, backsword, for those of you who have not come across this before, was a sort of form of training for the military. It was enabled to those who would be in the cavalry or otherwise, and other soldiers, of course, in those days with swords, to practice without actually inflicting too much of damage. But they had wooden staves, but the idea was still to win, and you'll find out why in a moment. And this backsword match took place in July 1839. And this little notice from the Reading Mercury highlights the fact that a rustic but not less ancient match at backsword would come off at Aldbourne on Monday scene night. So I had to quickly look that one up, and apparently it means week. It's 7 nights, just with the apostrophe, quite clever. 7 nights, so it's actually on Monday week. So surely that would have just pushed it in to feast time. Whilst the celebrated ringers of that village will perform some of their best peals upon their mellow sounding bells. Your bell still sounding mellow, Terry? Oh, right. No. Okay. Okay. So Terry from the audience was just saying there'd been a ringing gallery at that time, so things would have been rung from a slightly different position than they are these days, anyway. But anyway, backsword, that was the entertainment, probably as part of Aldbourne Feast. And it wasn't a one-off, because 14 years later, Berkshire Chronicle, just again, the end of July, reported that one of the relics if not the Middle, but certainly the Dark Ages, is still kept alive at Aldbourne, where a revel was held on Monday and Tuesday last, where that single stick was to be played. 8 half-crowns to be given to the first 8 couples, provided they played out, and 1 sovereign for the best man at last. Half a crown, I checked, was about £10 at today's values. The blood had to run for 1 inch, or it wasn't allowed, and no prize will be given unless a head be broken. I don't think they actually meant a fractured skull, but certainly blood had to run to the extent of 1 inch. So still reasonably bloodthirsty stuff. Hence my warning at the beginning. The newspaper took the high ground. They didn't witness this exhibition. No one can countenance such things. But there's much different opinion exists for the propriety of doing so. And he goes on to say that there's no doubt the pluck and fearless courage of our soldiers might not have been acquired in some place in such practices in these early days. So it probably gives some idea that it was a recognised way of training, and certainly for the military. Well, I saw Feast last week. I don't remember any backsword, which is a pity because it still exists. Still takes place in this country. There are backsword associations, and often you can see it at country fair exhibits, and apparently right up until 2018 they were attending the country fairs. There's one down at Bowood in a couple of weeks' time, but I spoke to the organisers, and apparently the backsword doesn't appear in the schedule these days. But it seems quite possible we could actually tempt them to come back to Aldbourne at some time and give an exhibition. Volunteers, anyone in the audience? Sorry, club in Swindon. Oh, you're using the phrase club lightly there. No pun intended. Right, another activity in the 1800s, hair coursing. And this is from an unusual publication. Lots of the newspapers that I'm using in this talk are fairly, regional ones. This is one from Bell's Life in London and Sporting Chronicle, bit of a mouthful, from March 1867. And this gives an account the previous week of a meeting that took place on the Downs. And it's lamented there that there aren't more people taking part in these meetings. There were plenty of hares around, but in course of the mildness of the weather, they were on the move and difficult to sow home. Now, I've not come across that, and I couldn't find a quite meaning for soho, unless somebody knows, but it's obviously sound a bit like hunting and tally-ho and that sort of thing, but this was a soho. Anyway, plenty to try out the greyhounds. And Mr. Chandler, that was still just Thomas Chandler, out at North Farm. He left the village in 1869, a couple of years after this. He not only finds us hares, but his larder and cellar are open to all with true old English welcome. So it sounds as if there was plenty of jollification, eating and drink taking place. So that's hare coursing in 1867, looking a bit like that, and something which we probably don't countenance much these days, as an illegal sport, but things was quite popular. At that Aldbourne event, there was a stakes, Aldbourne stakes for puppies. There was an East Lees stakes, the Russley stakes, all very local name, the Lambourne stakes, and the consolation stakes for all ages. Plenty of opportunity for betting. Hugely popular. One account, up to 80,000 people used to attend these events. By the sound of it, not in Aldbourne, because it sounded as if they were rather expecting a better turnout. And of course, it eventually morphed into greyhound racing in the 1920s, when they started off with the mechanical lure. And now, of course, as I say, hare coursing, generally nighttime hare coursing, is an illegal pastime. Terry be pleased that we're back to cricket match again. But moving on to the 1870s, a slight variation where it's just Aldbourne Cricket Club, but the married playing against the single members. And the married ones won by 18 runs. Unfavourable weather, but they did quite well. And again, names prop up there that we know. This is, you can see W. Chandler. I think that was William, who took over after Thomas had left North Farm. Walter Lawrence, familiar name, and Thomas, it says there Hadder. I'm fairly sure that should be Hodder. And that's obviously just newspapers sometimes get these things wrong. And they did well with their scores, which went to double figures. So interesting that cricket persisting and still quite popular even in the 1870s. Whoops, I think I've jumped ahead a bit there. Concerts, Reading Mercury, 1879, a high-class concert in the Aldbourne schools. Now you've got to think of again about locations. The school next to the church was completed in the late 1850s, and it had a generous sized room, not overly large, which would have been used for the school during the course of the day. But it had to be cleared away whenever they held concerts, which in later years proved quite a problem for the school. But anyway, at that time, concerts took part in there. So we had selections from Messiah and Creation, and then more secular music followed on afterwards. And again, you recognise some of the names there, Cleather and Millard and what's the other one? Laverick, I've seen quite successful. Yes, there, Cleather was the vicar. Oh, is it one of the sons? Thank you, John. I wasn't sure. No. And the concert was a great success, was under the direction of Mr. Sykes. There's another report of the same concert, which goes into a little bit more detail. And it talks about H. Cleather, an old familiar friend of the people of Aldbourne, which rather suggests that he'd left the village, but had come back perhaps to help out with the concert. And he was very popular, and they did at least 1, 2 encores, and they would a 10th until he sang one of his comic songs. We cannot help saying from this stole in the 2 lines of his song where, that's right, that he's up to a good deal more than he attempts and hope another day to hear him again. One fault found by the reporter, that was with the lighting in the room. So somebody was singing The People Who Walked in Darkness. There were people sitting in darkness, dimness, half light enough, it said, hung 4 feet too high, was against old eyes. And perhaps this report would have been more accurate if a nice gas burner had been brighter. So obviously the school wasn't designed perhaps for a lot of artificial lighting. So when you had a concert in the school, it did have its limitations. Out and about this time. Again, the late 1800s, lots of reports in the newspapers of Methodist outings and picnics. Obviously limited in those days, horse-drawn carriages, but quite a decent turnout, quite a few there showing up. And they probably would have gone, perhaps 10, 20 miles even at those days to a suitable location for their picnic and back home again. And no doubt a similar transport for this following article. Now, does politics count as entertainment? Well, over the last few months or so, one might be tempted to think it could do. But the great thing in the 1890s was the great Liberal victory in East Wiltshire. Liberalism was just making a great foothold, particularly in the country areas with the country workers, and it was celebrated in impressive style. So they were just electing Mr. Hobhouse. I'll come back to him. And they had a large gathering, which we believe was down at Preston, with 1,500 people sitting down in a large marquee. Now that's quite impressive if you had 1,500 people in a marquee these days. It's more like a circus top, I should think. And then that followed on in the evening with an open air meeting of 3,000 or 4,000 people. So you imagine the logistics of people got to get to these meetings. Again, horse and cart, horse and trap, horses, whatever. No motor vehicles at that time. We're still talking 1892. And so it must have been a real nightmare in the village with traffic everywhere. Be worse than the M4 closing, I should think. Excuse my voice. Anyway, Mr. and Mrs. Hobhouse spoke from the wagon, and here indeed is the gentleman. He'd just been elected the MP for East Wiltshire. And he went on to be quite successful in the Liberal government, which was very popular right through until the outbreak of the First World War. In fact, he rose to become the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. Now, I know you've been waiting for this. What have pigs got to do with the entertainment in the village? Well, actually, not a great deal. But in 1896, the Swindon Advertiser and North Wilts Chronicle, wonderful titles the newspapers had in those days, the Pig Club Supper. That was the second anniversary, and it was celebrated in a room lent by Mrs. Jeeves. And it's interesting that the 30 or 40 members sat down to a substantial supper of, guess what? Ham and bread and cheese. And William Brown, one of the previous William Browns, not our current William Brown, I hasten to add, was in charge. The secretary gave a brief report of the year's work, which you have to do at these things, I suppose, met all its liabilities, still had some money in the bank. And the report was considered very satisfactory. The company spent the rest of the evening in a very jovial manner. Again, that comes back to our alcohol abuse. You have been warned. Moving on into the 20th century, March 1910, the Farringdon Advertiser. Now, lots of newspapers reported the fact that Aldbourne put on a village play. And most of you in the village have been here some time, will be aware of that. Some of the newcomers might not. But Mr. McAvoy, who resided in the village, wrote a play to be performed by the villagers. This was real original stuff, hadn't been done before. This was real rural theatre. And using the disused malt house, that's the old malt house down South Street, he was able to give the village a repertory theatre. And it gave it a fine send-off the previous Saturday. Mr. Grenville Barker, he was a big entrepreneur in the theatre world, and George Bernard Shaw, who came down. So quite an elite company. Quite clever how they converted it into a theatre. There was a stage and sunken seats for the orchestra and excellent lighting. And the play, of course, was The Village Wedding. The Heritage Centre is fortunate to actually hold a copy of the script of The Village Wedding still. And it was hoped, maybe still hoped, that maybe our local amateur dramatic society, the ALEC, may perform it again one day, who knows. But anyway, the actors in 1910 were all Aldbourne villagers, and again, quite a large attendance, 200 people. And the orchestra made up of village musicians as well. And the scene for the village wedding showed a cottage interior, so well thought out and so well acted. And there's some talk of taking the company to London. And indeed they did. They did go to London, they did perform in London, and they did perform in other theatres in the south, but were not successful in the north. Now, whether that's almost certainly down to the dialect, because obviously it would have been fairly strong Wiltshire dialect in the way it was presented. That was the whole point of it. And you've even got photographs. This was from one of the London stagings. Country drama Village Theatre opened. And so you can see some of the participants there, which is quite. And that was the called rustics. I love that. Rustics appear on the boards. As I say, it wasn't very PC, but did warn you. First World War. Yes, it comes and goes. Yeah, it comes and goes at the end of Aldbourne. And sometimes instead of an LD towards the beginning, you get a U or Aldbourne, as indeed it's pronounced quite a lot still these days. Anyway, First World War, local entertainment, of course, was principally for fundraising for the Red Cross in the village. And in 1918, the redoubtable North Wilts Herald again reported of a concert in the schoolroom. Remember, we still hadn't got the Memorial Hall, of course, at that stage. So anything that took place in the village of substance seemed to be in the schoolroom. Not much mention of the church after that very early mention before the school was built. So once the school was there, it did seem to swing towards that everything took place there. And I suppose a bit more secular surroundings. Anyway, a capital program had been arranged for a large audience and the following program. And you can see there the singers, the recitations, the songs, and a little bit of music. And some of the titles you may even recognize. And there's one down there towards the bottom, which I particularly like, where I think I'll show it on the next screen, if I can just jump on. There we are. It's the Come and Cuddle Me. Now, even today, you might think that might be a bit risque, but Miss Holloway from London sang that to the delight of the audience, no doubt. And then somebody sung Get Your Hair Cut with an encore, and that was Mr. S.J. Williams from Ramsbury, rough lot over at Ramsbury, of course. And lots of other not so well-known titles thereabouts. But obviously an important event, fundraising for the Red Cross, with lots of participations. And that, but they raised £7, 7 shillings and sixpence. Not a lot of money, but in its day, it obviously was a help. Times were hard by 1918 in all respects. Of course, food shortages were biting quite considerably in this country. So obviously that might have affected the takings. Now, I was hoping to play one of the songs from there, and I treated myself to a CD, which is over there, of 75 First World War songs. I was very disappointed to find that virtually none of these actually appeared on that CD. But I'm not going to disappoint you entirely. John McCormack, famous Irish tenor, which hopefully some of you have heard. He was very much the Pavarotti of his day. He sang not only in opera, but also popular songs. He made a vast amount of money. He actually became an American citizen. In the First World War, he gave the equivalent of £250,000 to the war effort. But one of his most famous songs is A Long Way to Tipperary. An interesting song in itself. At that time, was originally written, I think, in 1912 as a ballad. Very much somebody who'd come to London and was missing their old home city, home area of Ireland. But it was adapted as a marching song in the First World War. And of course, remembering a lot of Irish soldiers in the First World War, because that was before the Republic was set up. So they were fighting in the trenches as well. So I'm going to try and play an extract. That will give me a moment just to have another swig of water and just see if you can recognize this. I'm hoping. Hang on. I'm going to have to. Yeah, sure. Thank you. Remember, it's plugged in. I had all this set up. I thought it was going to work really, really well. There we are. Bear with, as they say. Right, almost there. Right.
Oh, it's not, is it?
Right. Thank you for your participation. I forgot to warn you about the audience participation. And I was going to say, I was going to dedicate it to Michael from the Blue Boar. Michael, of course, is the main organizer behind the music festival, has been for the last few years, but he's unable to be here tonight. I was going to dedicate it to him because he loves his music, and he comes from the village of Bruff, which is about 15 miles from Tipperary, actually in a different Irish county, but just across the border. So I was hoping that he might recognise it, and so pay tribute to his setting up the music festival. Right, we shouldn't forget, I mentioned feast earlier on in connection with backswording, but we need to go back. Of course, the feast has been allegedly running since 1222. It was set up, the church decided that there should be a celebration for any of the saints in the saints' days of St. Mary Magdalene. That was the church's original dedication. It was decreed to be the first Monday after the 22nd of July. Never quite sure which calendar, but it still works that way today. So this year happened to be its 800th anniversary. Didn't see much celebrating going on in the village with that respect, but indeed it was the 800th. And of course, in past times, as many of you will recall, those who've been living here a long time, it was time for members of the family to come back. Former inhabitants, old friends flocked to the village. Houses were redecorated, not just decorated, but redecorated. And vigety puddings were boiled in cloths along with sheep's head and vegetables. Well, we can pass over that bit, perhaps. And of course, the fair people were not allowed to enter the village until 7 p.m. on Sunday. Well, they're pretty much set up by 7 p.m. this year. They were here very early on Sunday. And of course, originally they would have been more, I can use the phrase, gypsy type people who would come to the village, because that was very much what you imported, the entertainment, although a lot of the entertainment was local, as it explains there. There were stalls selling sweets, cockles, mussels, winkles, how you get them fresh from the seaside, but there we are, and fried fish. I think that was a bit too early for chips in those days. It was generally fried fish, so chips may have come along a little later. Fortune telling, and a blacksmith from Wittenditch who walked on nails and put hot nails in his mouth. Oh, yeah, I wonder if we can get Mark Hart to recreate that for us. Yeah, I'll mention that to him. And there were lots of boys with water pistols. And I put squirts in there because later on in the 20s, there were several reports from the parish council meetings as to whether they were going to allow squirts at the feasts, because obviously the boys were a bit of a nuisance, I would think. I didn't see the outcome of that, but they did attempt to sort of ban the squirts. Oh, they did ban. Oh, yeah, Cassie says they did ban squirts. Yeah, it's a bit like until recently you used to be able to throw coins at the people on the floats. We don't do that anymore. Health and safety, of course. So very much a homespun entertainment feast in those days. Now we do tend to rely on the visiting fair. And this was one of a very few photographs, believed to be 1906, but a very, very similar view to what there was here last week, except as you can see, possibly in the background on the right-hand side, more like gypsy-type caravans rather than the great wagons that Scarrets bring with them these days. And what appears to be a coconut shy, possibly in the bottom left-hand corner. Certainly looks like the sort of thing I remember from a few years ago. Whatever happened to coconut shies? Yes, they disappeared. Right. Again, non-PC, this is. There was a fancy dress event took place in the village, and it was just before, of course, the outbreak of the First World War. So who knows of those people in this, who might have survived and those who sadly fell in the First World War. An interesting pic, not quite sure what the purpose of it was. February 24th is on the photograph, 1914, just a fancy dress group. And it presumably was photographed perhaps in the school hall. Again, where would you have such a big venue as that? Doesn't look much like it. I wondered if it might be one of the Methodist churches, because you've got sort of banners in the background, but a bit speculative. The feast was effectively suspended during World War I, but it was quickly revived as reported in July 1919. And this was one of the oldest and best known of the Wiltshire festivals. And it went on Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday with celebrations worthy of the palmiest days of the old institution. And even in the, as it says, years preceding the war, Aldbourne Feast was sometimes little more than a date in the calendar, marked only by the arrival of the village of the usual fair, and sometimes a flower show. But this year it was much more ambitious. They went sports, a garden fete, a bazaar, fancy dress whist drive. So there was a lot more audience participation, we might say then. And obviously it was after the end of the First World War. Proceeds, as you might expect then, to swell the funds for the village hall. They'd already raised £720. And there were roundabouts, swings and sideshows arriving and did a roaring trade. Prices having risen 100% since before the war. Lots of attractions, but particularly the sports. Very successful sports seemed to take place in the village in those days, down in Mr. Wilson's meadow. Is that the one down South Street? Yeah. No, well, that's the actual football field, is it? Yeah. Terry Wilson's field. I wasn't quite sure if it was where the nursing home was, or it's the farm lane area. Farm lane area. Okay, thank you, Terry. Yeah. And so, although it says here, although the list of events did not include the ancient fax hoarding, which used to be practiced in Aldbourne in days gone by, when the young men smote each other with ash staves and the first who drew blood was the winner. We must bring that back. We're missing out, definitely. Yeah, tremendous enthusiasm for the sports and tug of war. Again, I think we've had tug of war in the time that I've been in the village, and I'm fairly sure that you'll say it was popular until not so long ago. And in those days, a team from Upham defeated Stacey's team in the final round. And the most keenly contested of the athletic events, the hurdle race, which promised a race. There was a race for men over 50s, all sorts. So, you know, a lot went on at Feast in those days. Similar thing, I found this in a much more recent publication, pushball. Apparently very popular in the 1920s and 30s, generally, not just in the village here. Again, seldom seen in the 1970s and very seldom seen this year. 6-foot diameter ball, game between two teams, and everyone else pushing at either end of the pitch. So we've got a picture of a pushball event. This is fairly elderly. And to me, that sounds quite an interesting, fun thing to do. No, I can't see too many serious injuries like black swording. I don't know how many people is allowed to join in. Presumably, the more the merrier. Yeah, and you push it up down the pitch. So, oh, great. I don't see that in the Commonwealth Games, but who knows? Perhaps we can get that. Where did they get a 6-foot ball from in those days? Amazing. But I did look it up, and it was quite popular throughout the country. It wasn't just a local event. Back to our teams. Obviously, if the days of the horse and drawn carriages had long gone, at least we had some mechanised transport. I counted 43 passengers here. Mustn't right. So whether that's health and safety, I'm not quite sure. But obviously, a real charabanc outing was that one. And we believe that one to be from the village. Once the Memorial Hall had opened, there was still lots of money needed to be raised. You remember they didn't come into the black until about 12 years after the hall was actually erected. It took a long time, and many more events took place. The hall at least provided the venue for the events. So we were able to have public debate and lecture, children's party, while they still take place, concert to raise funds for the primitive Methodists, and fortnightly concerts. Nowadays, gaps between concerts are much longer. It takes a while to organise things, but they were regular events then. And billiards exhibition matches took place. Billiards, of course, was very popular before snooker came along. Snooker really only came into its own in the days of colour television, really. I remember watching billiards matches on the TV in certainly late 50s and 1960s. And billiards became popular in the village once they acquired their own tables. And in 1925, a gold and silver tree fundraiser. I've seen that mentioned a couple of times, not sure what it is. Does anyone know what the... No, gold and silver? Well, we shall find someday. (1931), the North Wilts Herald reported on a whist drive on behalf of the branch of the Unionists Association. Am I right in saying Unionists used to sort of be conservatives, different terminology? The Wesleyan Women's Guild Social, 110 people attending. That's pretty good going. Without the stage, that's about the right capacity, but they were dancing as well. And then this one, which I rather clumsily highlighted, was the Sunday School Christmas Tea. And some of you may know that I've highlighted that for two reasons. Kenneth Brind, who won something, sadly died last week in Canada, 3 months short of his 100th birthday. Yeah, Ken Brind. Yeah, he was still taking copies of the Dabchick, which we still post to him, and no doubt an obituary, no doubt, will probably appear. Yeah, so sadly passed away in Canada, where he'd lived for many years, of course. But there he was as a youngster, receiving a prize when he was about 8 or 9. And a special prize for Alan Lydiard. Alan Lydiard, of course, was the blacksmith, ran the forge for many, many years, for never being absent or late during the whole year at Sunday school. Quite something. And there was an annual fundraising dance for the Wilts Institute for the Blind, with a jazz band, again dancing 8 till 1 in fancy dress. We're seldom allowed to go past midnight these days, I think, for any entertainment in the village. Yeah, they danced on, and of course jazz, very popular in the 20s and 30s. 1933, sport back again. The cricket matches are getting funnier and funnier in a way. This is between the men and the ladies. And this was held as part of Carnival Week. I think you probably get to the bit where the men are handicapped in having to bat left-handed. And they foolishly declared at 71 for 5, but it was 2 previous because the ladies scored 79 and won the match. Yay. Okay, Terry informs me that probably would have been in the West Street Meadow on from the Carnival Field. That's why I inadvertently referred to that earlier as probably being the cricket. So yeah, just up beyond Manor Farm as it is these days. Miss Jackson, you may notice there, scored 48 of the 79. So things were looking up for the ladies then, as indeed they are these days. And here is a picture of what appears to be a comedy cricket match. Probably not the same one because there was no mention of fancy dress in that other editorial. But here, obviously, the men are in fancy dress, ladies in a form of outfit, but they've got cricket bats, so it does still look as if that could well be a comedy cricket match at some time. Could have been a little earlier, bit hard to tell from the dress of the spectators in the background. Some of it looks a little older, particularly there's a young lad right on the extreme left-hand side who appears to be wearing one of the old starch collar things. So it might have even been pre-war, but it's such a nice picture, thought I'd put it in anyway. Yes, John, sorry.
I'm not sure. But it was cricket match between gentlemen and ladies.
Oh yeah, gentlemen and ladies. Oh, seems fair enough. Yes, I think that's fair enough. Yeah. So John from the back there saying that it's possibly. Well, would it have been earlier than the 30s? You think, John? Yeah, 22. Thank you. 1932. We're now moving on. I've referred to the North Wilts Herald a few times. It was a newspaper that existed from the late 1860s right through to 1941. And it was fascinating because they had local correspondents in the village. And so virtually weekly, you would get some information about what was going on in Aldbourne. It may have only been the parish council reports or something like that, but also social events, a tremendous source of information. And this vaudeville show took place to a delighted audience. And the Aldbourne ringers, under the direction of Mr. Jerram, rang down the curtain. I assume that'll be handbells, of course. Yeah, thank you, Terry. A unanimous vote, one of the most delightful concerts held in the village for a long time. Now, that could be the sort of thing, typical jazz band of the 20s and 30s. And as I said, there was a source of information for a long time as the North Wilts Herald. This may interest Jan. A folk dancing society existed in the 30s in the village. I think possibly influenced by the fact that Gerald Finzi, the composer, lived at Beech Knoll at that time. He was very fond of adapting country music, I think, into formal music. And there was a very popular folk dancing society. And they held a masked dance in the Memorial Hall to the profit of £10. And this is going to be devoted to the expense of the society. And there was even an exhibition. Some people came down from London and gave 2 exhibition dances. And the hall was tastefully decorated by the dance committee with autumn tints of the leaves and coloured electric lights interspersed. A charming setting. And then, almost finally, you'll be relieved to learn one further entertainment which arrived quite late into the village was a cinema. And this was 1937, so fairly late on. The cinema had been around for quite a few years before that, but you obviously had to travel off into the great town of Swindon or somewhere perhaps to see it, or even over to Ramsbury, because Ramsbury had a occasional cinema before Aldbourne, as is mentioned. So at a meeting of the management committee of the hall, it was announced that the preliminaries were in place. The building went a special chamber to hold the projector and the films, and the weekly rent obtained will greatly benefit the funds, and the hall should now be self-supporting. So it was another fundraising feature for the hall as well. And Mr. Beckett at Ramsbury and other places, they looked as if he was going to be providing the films. And that the good films in the village will meet a long felt want, and that the expenses incurred will be more than met by hiring the hall. And the first thing to be shown, 2nd of June, will be the coronation. So that'll be the coronation of George V, Queen Elizabeth, 1937. So you'll be relieved to know we're getting towards the end. We rather take it for granted these days because there are dozens of activities and groups in the village. And we've got a far more amount of leisure time to participate. So we've got sort of way that up in the past. They worked, particularly in the farmers would have worked all the hours that were available, and they didn't have time perhaps always to organise a lot of leisure. So when they did have the occasional leisure event, they really went for it. And they had a day off work, maybe they were really lucky. And so the roots of all that we do and enjoy ourselves these days laid down 200 years ago. And I'd like to thank, as usual, indirectly, the National Newspaper Archive. I've used that a lot for my recent talks. This is the facility that holds online some 54 million pages of news. Should you so wish to sign up for a small subscription for about 60 or 70 pounds, you can look at 54 million pages of news, of which Aldbourne features about 22,000 times, if you so wish to have a look through. A lot of that is sports references, horse racing, because when we had stables here, every time a horse ran, brackets, Aldbourne would close brackets, because that would be the trainer and all the rest of it. So loads and loads of those. But if you sort them through, you get some of the material that I've been using this evening. And don't forget, the Music Song Festival continues for a few more days. If you've not got your little leaflet, tomorrow night, Jonathan Callsbrook, that should be a fun event. And then there's the musical safari, which with the weather holding out still well, looks a little bit showery on Wednesday, but hopefully the musical safari will be good, as it often is. Community sing-along, and then in the Blue Boar, the music quiz on Friday, and then big events again over the weekend, ending up, of course, with the Proms concert on the Green.